And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the debut episode of Red Storm Warning. I'm your host, Michael Scott. Happy to join you on this afternoon, on this Monday evening. Just to give you a quick introduction of myself before I dive into the topics on the show. If you can't tell by the introduction and the music and the name, this is going to be a St. John's college basketball show. It'll be every Monday from 1 to 2. I'm repping my St. John's quarter zip right now. So first, a quick introduction about myself before I dive into the main topics. So I'm a graduate of St. John's. I just graduated last week. I did sports broadcasting at WSU Sports, so I got to really cover this St. John's basketball team. So that's why I feel like that gives me an expertise to give you my analysis. I'll talk about the roster as St. John's is shooting it right now. I'll talk about the non-conference schedule as St. John's has some more key games on the platform to play. And then I'll dive into a little bit of the players that are leaving and potentially making it to the NBA because, look, right now we have a local tie that's in the playoffs. One of our Johnnies could potentially be on that team in the horizon. So first, let me dive into this St. John's off-season. Look, St. John's came into this season riding the high of making it to the Sweet 16 last season. They did not make the Sweet 16. They haven't done that since the early 90s. So being able to be in person for that, for WSU Sports, for St. John's, getting to see the Johnnies represented on the national stage against Duke. Even though Duke was able to pull out the win, it was a good experience to be there in person to catch the Johnnies on action. So St. John's made a lot of offseason moves, and if you're new to the NCAA tournament and the way a roster is structured, I'll just give you a quick analysis if you're new. Now with the transfer portal and NIL, and if you're wondering what NIL is, it's name, image, and likeness. Players now can make money off of their brand and their name. So now, because of that factor, the transfer portal has been very active in the last couple of years. So St. John's has had to go to the transfer portal because they've lost a lot of guys. Some of them, Zuby Ejiofor, Bryce Hopkins, Dylan Mitchell, Osiah Sellers, Josan Sandin, and Dylan Darling. And I'll mention in a little bit where those guys are going. But St. John's, in my opinion, took an interesting route heading into the transfer portal. They relied a lot on European players from overseas, and I'll dive into that in a little bit, a potential rule that could impact that right now doesn't affect the Johnnies, but could impact teams like the Johnnies and other schools in the near future. So the first move I want to talk about St. John's getting is a point guard, overseas, played in the EuroLeague in Italy, Quinn Ellis. And I really like this move for St. John's. It was really their first addition to the squad of Quinn Ellis. He's a point guard. And one thing that the St. John's team lacked, in my opinion, last season, covering them and seeing them in person and via the media outlet, they did not have enough point guards on the roster. And I feel like St. John's only had really one point guard on their roster, and Dylan Darling, who had a phenomenal season and definitely was going to be a St. John player that I wish came back, but he went to Grand Canyon for better opportunity. But I felt like St. John's really needed a point guard to start their offseason. And with all the experts' opinion on the profile of this guy, Quinn Ellis, he's the ultimate point guard. He's a facilitator. He's a pass point guard first. He can score the ball a little bit, average double digits overseas. But I feel like he came to St. John's before because of his playmaking skills. And I feel like he was the perfect start to the offseason. It's going to be interesting to see how he blends with the returning players like Ian Jackson, Ruben Play, and etc. So I really like that move first for St. John's. It caught me off guard because normally this day and age of college basketball, the power of social media, you would hear like reports that, oh, St. John's is showing interest in that player. This move came under the radar. No reports were made. It actually kind of was a surprise to a lot of St. John fans, including myself. So seeing St. John's pick up a point guard this caliber, and Rick Pitino has been talking about how this was the guy they wanted. They were really eyeing him overseas. He actually almost went to the NBA draft a couple years ago, but elected to stay overseas. So Quinn Ellis was the first major move for St. John's, and I'm really excited to see how he blends with the new talent and the adjustment because, look, he played overseas. I'm going to mention a couple other guys are going to have to make that adjustment too. It's not that easy transferring from overseas playing European basketball the language barrier, the way NCAA college basketball is kind of different. I'm going to be interesting to see that adjustment that Quinn Ellis makes. So the second move I want to talk about that St. John's made, another international guy, was Babcock Sane, who is from the Euro League but also played in G League for the NBA. And look, this guy has a lot of high ceiling, in my opinion. He just got addition to St. John's a few weeks ago. He was actually projected to be in the starting lineup, but another move that I'm going to mention in a few kind of affected him. But I really see him being that third or fourth big off the bench, giving St. John's size and versatility. His profile is that he has like a football athleticism, which I feel like now in college basketball, especially in the Big East, as I'm going to talk about other Big East schools and compare them to St. John's, he really is physical and athletic, and I think last year kind of St. John's lacked that off the bench, and I feel like Sane can bring that with St. John's. I don't think he has a lot of offensive ceiling compared to Quinn Ellis. I think he's more of a defensive guy first. But one thing that Rick Pitino is known for is that player development. It'll be interesting to see how Rick Pitino and the coaching staff for St. John's can maybe add some more offensive game to Sane and maybe create a difference maker off the bench with St. John's. Two other guys that St. John's got from the Euro League, I don't know what their role is going to be. They could be developmental guys. There could be guys that are like the 10th or 11th guy off the bench. But they are two guys that have size like Sane. And that's one thing I noticed about St. John's. Besides Ellis, all of their other European additions were big guys with length and athleticism, which Rick Pitino's known for wanting in his system. So those guys are Đorđe Jokovic and Lazar Stankovic. Both guys that don't have a lot of experience overseas. They weren't really a star player, but I feel like they can develop into really good pieces off the bench potentially. Because St. John's, they love to go to their bench. One thing that this St. John's team is not like previous coaching staff, they go deep in their bench. They can go 9 or 10 deep. So it's going to be interesting to see if those guys can carve out roles with this St. John's team. But I definitely think they're high upside guys that potentially, if they decide to stay with the program, which is not a certainty, it'll be interesting to see maybe if they can have a bigger role with next season team. Because I feel like with one spot left on the roster, one scholarship guy left, I feel like St. John's rotation is pretty set. And I don't know if those guys can maybe push them to change that rhetoric. So one of the two now going beyond Euro League transfers that transferred from schools in the United States. The first guy I want to talk about is Donnie Freeman. Donnie Freeman is a power forward from Syracuse, averaged close to 17 points last season. This was the first marquee pickup by St. John's, in my opinion. St. John's lost Zuby Ejiofor, Dylan Mitchell, Bryce Hopkins, all front court players that really were the DNA of the St. John's team. Because last season, St. John's did not get off to a good start. And once Rick Pitino went with a bigger starting five, adding Dylan Mitchell into the starting five with Hopkins and Zuby, St. John's physicality defensively was really up to the par. They really were able to strive defensively because St. John's really struggled off the gate, and a lot of people were hitting the panic button, including myself, covering the team. So I feel like Donnie Freeman is like equivalent to Dylan Mitchell, but he has more offensive upside than Mitchell, and I think Mitchell was the better defender. And in my opinion, if St. John's wants to maybe surpass the Sweet 16 last season, they have to be better defensively, not midpoint into the season, not late into the season, from the start. Because as I'm going to mention down the road, St. John's has a pretty tough non-conference schedule. They have marquee opponents that have high-octane offense, so they cannot afford to struggle defensively like they did last year. And I feel like Donnie Freeman, look, he was on the Syracuse team last year that underachieved a lot. I'm sure maybe at times he might have not put his all into it. But look what Pitino has shown. If you're not playing defense on his team, he doesn't care how good offensively you are, you're not going to play. So I'm going to be interesting to see how Donnie Freeman improves as a defender. But offensively, he can shoot the ball. He's a presence in the post. I'm really excited to see how Donnie Freeman adjusts to the St. John's team. And in my opinion, he has the potential to be maybe not the top scorer, but one of the top scorers with the Johnny's organization. So another transfer I'm going to talk about that just recently committed to St. John's and kind of was a a splash for the Johnnies was the transfer from Baylor, Tode Yesufu, who is a transfer from Baylor. He was getting looked at in the NBA draft, and one thing that we've noticed recently, the news has broken, that a lot of guys that have entered the draft, if they're getting coaching or advice from the NBA staff that maybe you should go back to college and play one more year, we're starting to see guys exit the NBA draft and going back to college. The luckily thing with St. John's is Yesufu wanted to transfer out of Baylor, and St. John's was the perfect spot. It's kind of ironic. On Twitter, Rick Pitino posted a picture with all the coaching staff at a restaurant called Leo's, which ironically happened the day before Yesufu committed to St. John's. So a lot of people are speculating, oh, this was the dinner that kind of sealed the job. And it's kind of ironic. I kind of agree with that because, look, Rick Pitino coming to St. John's was a marquee move for St. John's. I feel like St. John's has been irrelevant in the last 10 years. And Rick Pitino, his name, his accolades, being one of the best coaches, not only in college basketball, but in the NBA with his ties there. I feel like St. John's has been officially back. And all the years Rick Pitino's been with St. John's, I think it's his third or fourth year, he's made St. John's improve win-wise and into the tournament. Every year it's taking a boost. So last season they made the Sweet 16. Hopefully now they make it to the national championship and potentially win a national championship, which they haven't done for a good while. So I think Yesufu is the star on the St. John's team. I said I think Donnie Freeman could potentially be the top scorer. I think Yesufu definitely has the potential to be one of St. John's leading scorers. He averaged 17 points at Baylor. I think he can go past that, can surpass that with 20 points. And I think he gives St. John's size at the guard position, which Quinn Ellis and Ian Jackson, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, as one of the returning players, they don't have as much size that you want to see at a guard position. And we've seen this in years past with St. John's, especially when Rick Pitino did with Kadari Richmond. He likes size not only at his forward position, but at his guard position. So I'm definitely going to be interesting to see how Yesufu comes to St. John's. And Rick Pitino's already had multiple quotes praising the young guy, not only on the court, but off the court. So I really think Yesufu is going to be a big addition to St. John's. Now, some other moves to wrap up the offseason talk for St. John's. St. John's picked up Kyle Cuff Jr., a guard from Mercer, who, ironically, his dad went to St. John's in the early 2000s. So it's kind of an ironic and a nice civil moment to have both Cuff, the father, and the son both play at St. John's. So I think Cuff is not really a scoring guard. I think he's more going to be a guy off the bench to give Quinn Ellis and Ian Jackson time off the court when they need a break. I think he can bring St. John's a veteran presence off the bench. He actually was a high commit when he committed to Kansas, but he hasn't really lived up to expectations. So I feel like this was a good under-the-radar move by St. John's to give them versatility off the bench at the guard position and give them a veteran presence. Another guard that St. John's picked up from Columbia, which is not really known for their basketball. They're more of an Ivy League school. But St. John's picked up Avery Brown, who's another guard who kind of right now profiles to be the backup point guard, as Quinn Ellis is going to be the starting point guard. But I feel like those guys are probably going to be the point guards on St. John's. And look, that gives St. John's 2 point guards on their roster. That's more than they did last season when they only had Dylan Darling. So that's going to wrap it up with the offseason additions. I want to talk about returning players and what impact they potentially have. So the first guy I want to talk about is Ian Jackson. Ian Jackson, who was a high recruit coming to North Carolina 2 years ago, committed to St. John's last season from the transfer portal and had up and down season. He started at times, he came off the bench. He didn't really get consistent playing time, and a lot of people were wondering why. I wasn't really surprised because, look, Ian Jackson was a liability defensively. St. John's needed to have their best defensive lineup on the floor at times, and Ian Jackson didn't bring that. Look, he's shown flashes. He had good games at Nova. He had good games at the Garden in conference play, which I think can transcend to this season coming up for St. John's. But another major thing that he had to deal with was he had to play out of position. I've mentioned it throughout the show so far. St. John's only had 1 point guard in Dylan Darling, who came into the season supposed to be the backup point guard. So Ian Jackson had to shift from the shooting guard to the point guard, and at times was the starting point guard for St. John's. I'm sure a lot of you were saying, oh, that's not that bad of a transition. You're just moving. You're going to be handling the ball more. But he was only really known to be a shooting guard, and he wasn't really the facilitator that Quentin Ellis is going to come to be with St. John's. That's why I really love the Ellis pickup, because Ian Jackson can now stay at his natural shooting guard position. And I think he has the potential to be that five-star recruit that when he came into college to be. So I'm expecting big things from Ian Jackson. Another player that's returning to St. John's is Ruben Play. And boy, do I love Ruben Play's game. Can defend 1-5. He's a stretch 5 that can really shoot the ball. I think he has to work on a little muscle, because I don't think he's a typical 5, the center for St. John's. And in the Big East, the physicality, the competition, the non-conference slate, I think Ruben Play might need to add a little muscle. But Ruben Play was a backup big for St. John's the last 2 years because of Zuby Ejiofor, the superstar for St. John's. And boy, am I going to miss seeing Zuby not only on campus at St. John's, a friendly face, always says hi to whoever says hi to him, but also him as a basketball player. And I'm sure he's going to be heading into the NBA very soon. But I'm really expecting big things from Ruben Play. And hopefully he and Ian Jackson can complement these new players for St. John's. In my opinion, I think the starting five is set right now. St. John's still has one more open roster spot. It's going to be interesting to see who they go with at that spot. So right now, I think the starting five is going to be Quinn Ellis, Ian Jackson, Yesufu, Donnie Freeman, and Ruben Play. And I think the bench is going to be either Kyle Cuff, Avery Brown, or Tiras Kriotopoulos, who's another returning player who really gives St. John's a boost shooting the ball off the bench. Great three-pointer, has to work on his defense. And then the backup big, it could be Bake Stain, who I mentioned as a guy who I have a lot of expectations for, because now St. John's doesn't really have a backup big. They were actually looking at Milan Mikovic from Iowa State, who is a stretch 5 that can really shoot the ball. But now, because of the pickup of Yesufu, they invested, reports were around $6 to $7 million in NIL money. They cannot afford the services of Milan from Iowa State. So I think the one flaw that I would say about the St. John's roster, I think offensively, they have a lot of gifted scorers. I think the size is going to hurt St. John's. And when I talk about comparing them to the Big East later on in the show, I really think that's going to be a glaring issue that St. John's needs to address. Because in the Big East, there's a lot of big top centers in the league. And I think that's going to be one thing at St. John's. It's not a strength compared to those other teams. That's going to do it for the off-season talk. I like St. John's off-season as a whole. If I had to grade it, I'll give it a B+, because you don't really know how these European guys are going to transfer into college basketball. But I'm expecting big things, especially from Quinn Ellis. So now moving on to my next topic, I want to talk about the non-conference schedule, because St. John's has already announced some of the games on Twitter. You've seen reports. There's multiple games that are marquee, and the first one I want to talk about is an old-fashioned Big East Conference matchup between the Syracuse Orange. Look, Syracuse has not been the same team as they did in years past. I think, in my opinion, their move out of the Big East into the ACC has really hurt them as a basketball school. So I think getting the old-fashioned Big East between Syracuse and St. John's, it's just fun to watch. I don't know if Syracuse, talent-wise, is up to the par with St. John's, but I really like bringing back the old-fashioned Big East. The game's going to be in MSG, so there's going to be a lot of local fans from Syracuse making the trip over from upstate New York into MSG. You have a lot of storylines. You have Donnie Freeman, as I mentioned, the former Syracuse player, facing off against his old team. It's always nice to see revenge games on the docket. You also have Kyle Cuff, who I mentioned went to Syracuse before he went to Mercer. He also is a factor in this one. Also, you have a factor. Former Nick Blake, Carmelo Anthony's son, Kiyan Anthony, is one of Syracuse's top players. I'm sure Carmelo Anthony is going to be courtside to see his son play at MSG. That's one thing that St. John's has probably over other teams. They play their home games not only on campus at Carnesecca Arena, they play at Madison Square Garden. That's a factor why kids want to come to St. John's, to be under the bright lights of MSG, play under that New York crowd. And look, we've seen it the last couple of years. St. John's is relevant again. They're talked about like the Knicks are. And now people are starting to come to MSG The atmospheres have been wild down the stretch last season. I remember being in the building for that UConn game, calling it for WSU Sports. It felt like a postseason atmosphere. I feel like that's what kids also want to come to St. John's. Not only to play under one of the best coaches in the Pitino, not only for NIL, but exposure, MSG, the crowd. So I really think, I think St. John's is going to handle Syracuse win by double digits because I just think they're the more talented team. But it's always good to see the Big East schools back playing one another. It's going to be interesting to see the crowd, and maybe Syracuse has an agenda. Maybe they were New York's team at one point. They're under a new era, hiring a Santa coach and getting their star player. It's going to be interesting to see how those two teams face off at MSG. Another game that I want to mention. There's a lot of marquee games, and I'm going one by one. But St. John's is slated to play back in the Players Era Festival. And one thing about that festival, it's St. John's is no strangers to that. They played it last year. They won one game and they lost two, so they didn't have the outcome maybe they wanted. But that Players Era tournament is expanded this season. I think it was like 8 teams to 10 teams last season. It expanded around 16 to 18 teams this year. And look, you have more key teams in that one. And there could be a potential matchup between St. John's and Louisville. And if you don't know the story, Rick Pitino was the coach at Louisville. He won a title there. Kind of did some shady stuff behind the business, and Louisville got their title revoked. That's going to add some juice. A lot of these matchups that St. John's has on their non-conference league, it's not only great games, but this storyline galore. You have that factor, and then you also have a lot of marquee opponents, like St. John's plays potentially Arizona, Texas Tech. So a lot of marquee matchups for St. John's, and that's why I'm going to really be putting my eye on to see how St. John's starts the season, because the European guys are going to have to adjust, but St. John's does not have an easy non-conference slate, and they need to wrap up the quad one wins early. And I think this Players Era tournament is going to be a good way for St. John's to do so. Another matchup that I'm going to talk about to close out the non-conference schedule, St. John's plays Alabama. They played them last season. I was at the game as a fan. Alabama blew St. John's number because they really shot the ball well. This time it's going to be at Alabama, so it's going to be the back end of a home and home. It's going to be interesting to see how St. John's does in that matchup. So that's going to do it for the non-conference slate. I'm sure there's going to be more games announced as the season gets closer. It's crazy. It feels like college basketball just ended in April, but college basketball is not that far away, a few months away, and I'm excited to see how the Johnnies look heading into in the off season. So now I want to talk about some guys that St. John's lost. I kind of mentioned it a little bit when I talked about the off season. Guys that left the program in order to go to the NBA draft or enter the transfer portal. The first guy I want to talk about is Zuby Ejiofor. In my opinion, Zuby Ejiofor was a fantastic John. He came into St. John's from Kansas, not playing a lot, barely getting any attention. Did not really come in with that superstar accolade that I feel like he now has after graduating from college. The player development between him and Rick Pitino, and you can tell if you followed the team last year, Rick Pitino really enjoyed Zuby Ejiofor, not only as a player, because he was a dominant force inside the paint, as a person. You can really tell how emotional he got when Zuby was starting to play his last games as a St. John's player. And in my opinion, following St. John's all 4 years, getting to see Zuby Ejiofor's development, improvement as a player, he came into St. John's not really good offensively and subpar defensively, but now after his senior year, winning Big East Player of the Year, winning Defensive Player of the Year, winning Scholar Athlete of the Year, that shows he's a student athlete, the student coming before the athlete. He had a phenomenal renaissance with St. John's. He can shoot the ball from three-point range. He's a force down low in the paint, has that skyhook shot. One of the best defenders in the NCAA. I felt like he got disrespected nationally because he should have been on the All-American First Team, which is the top accolade for players in college basketball. He's definitely going to be missed. It's actually interesting to see reports that potentially Zuby can go to the Knicks. Now, I've seen the Knicks right now in the NBA Finals, and as a Knicks fan, I'm sure that's not the main talking point, but as a St. John's guy, seeing Zuby Ejiofor potentially on that Knicks team, he has experience playing at the Garden, as I mentioned, with St. John's. That would just be poetic justice if Zuby Ejiofor can come back to MSG and play with the Knicks, stay local, I'm really cheering for that. But if he doesn't go to the Knicks, I really think Zuby Ejiofor is a first-round pick and has a bright future in the NBA. Two other guys that potentially could get drafted in the NBA draft, which is, I think, around a month away. Dillon Mitchell and Bryce Hopkins. I'll start with Bryce Hopkins first. Hopkins had a crazy season, to put it lightly, last year. Dealing with the scrutinized with Providence fans as that was his old school, getting fouled pretty hard by one of their players at Providence, getting booed. That was really a hostile environment. Seeing him, look, he didn't get off to the best year. He was battling injury. I feel like he wasn't really 100%. I really thought Hopkins really turned the page later in the season. I feel like he ended his career as a Johnny really fortunate, really beneficial. I thought he really played some really good basketball. I think he potentially has the potential to go to the G League. I don't know if he gets drafted. I think Hopkins needs more work on his game. But I wouldn't be shocked if he gets signed as an undrafted free agent by one of these NBA teams. And now the next guy I want to talk about, Dillon Mitchell. I saw a mock draft recently that Dillon Mitchell is slated to go to the Denver Nuggets late in the first round. And look, I think Dillon Mitchell is a fantastic defender. He can go 1 to 5. His offense just really needs to improve. And I don't know if a team in the NBA draft is going to be willing to use their pick on a guy that really doesn't have offensive upside. But I definitely think if he doesn't get drafted, which I kind of think he does because of how good a defender he is, the size and athleticism, we've seen that in the NBA, especially in the playoffs. A lot of teams love guys with like 6'7" size, athleticism, a flame like that. I think he does get picked up, but I wish good luck to all three of those guys being able to cover their senior year last year as Johnnies. I really think they have a bright future. So now I just want to talk about some guys that entered the transfer portal for St. John's. I'll start with Dylan Darling, Church Bells Darling, as his nickname was at St. John's. Boy, did Dylan Darling give you moments. He's not the most talented player, but he really showed out for St. John's. Going into that starting point guard role, as I mentioned, because St. John's didn't really have a lot of guards with that team last season. The game-winning shot against Kansas, I was so excited for that one. I was watching the game at home with my dad. I screamed to the top of my lungs because that propelled St. John's into the Sweet 16. Getting those moments. And as I alluded to the Providence game, St. John's got into a fight with Providence because St. John's was defending their player, Bryce Hopkins, because he got fouled very hardly by Duncan Powell of Providence. Both teams had a lot of ejections. And once after the referees calm everything down, Dylan Darling kind of took front center right now. He played at the point guard position. He really helped the team scoring the ball because St. John's didn't have as much depth because of a lot of the ejections. He really took the initiative with St. John's, and that really meant a lot to me. That showed that he put the team on his back, and I love Dylan Darling, and look, it's definitely disappointing that he entered the portal, but this day and age of college basketball, players enter the portal because they want maybe better opportunity, more playing time, and I just think the way St. John's was constructed, I don't think Dylan Darling was going to get a lot of playing time with this group. So he transferred to Grand Canyon, and I think that was the best spot for him as a whole. And I definitely wish him good luck because he was a terrific player, and he's definitely going to be someone I root for. Even though he's not a Johnny, but I really think Dylan Darling has the potential with that Grand Canyon team to do big things. So another guard that entered the transfer portal for St. John's was Josan Sannon. He transferred to West Virginia. And look, Sannon, he was really disappointed in my opinion. He came into St. John's as a shooter, but he had so many hot and cold days. One game he would shoot really good from three-point range. The other game he would be ice cold and he would barely get playing time. I thought Josan Sannon was disappointing in my opinion. I wish him luck when he on West Virginia in the Big 12. I wasn't as disappointed with that as I was with Darling because he was just very inconsistent for St. John's, and I felt like St. John's could have did a lot better at the guard position, and hopefully they did that with Quinn Ellis, Kyle Cuff, Avery Brown, and a returning Ian Jackson, and also Lefteris Viatopoulos, who initially entered the portal, but then changed his mind and thought St. John's was his best spot forward, and I agree with that decision. One more guy to wrap up the offseason talk with this departure of players is Sadiq Ibn Ayo. And Ayo, was more of the glue guy, the energy guy for St. John's coming off the bench. And I feel like he went back to Iona was a good story. I hopefully he gets more playing time with the Gales. But I really think Ayo as a player, he was one of St. John's team captains with Zuby Ejiofor. Great Johnny. Hopefully he has more playing time with the Iona Gales, and hopefully he can flourish in his new opportunity with that squad. So that's going to do it for that talk. And now I want to dive into a little talk from St. John's heading into the season, comparing them to the Big East schools. Because look, St. John's now with the addition of Yesufu, kind of is heading into a preseason top 25 heading into the season. I think St. John's right now is number one. I think they're the top team in the Big East. But look, I think the Big East is going to be more competitive this season compared to last season. I thought the Big East was very disappointing. St. John's and UConn were the class of that conference. But I really think now the way other schools have entered the portal, I think the Big East is going to be very competitive this season, and I think potentially getting more bids than they did last season. So I want to just talk about a few of the transfer portal additions from other schools. I'll start with those UConn Huskies because them and St. John's are battling for number one in the Big East. So the first move that UConn got was Nigene Hines, who was a transfer from Seton Hall. So an in-conference transfer edition. I was kind of disappointed because I wanted him potentially for St. John's, because St. John's, in my opinion, as I mentioned during the show, they looked at a lot of bigs, but they weren't able to get any. That's why right now Ruben Play is their starting five, because they weren't able to get that marquee big off the bench. And I think Nigene Hines, seeing him in the Big East, guy with size, athleticism, I think UConn can do a good job working on his scoring game, and he's a very good defender. Led the Pirates in blocks, who are averaging 2 per game. So I really think that was a great pickup by UConn. They're losing guys to the NBA draft also. I think Nigene Hines was the perfect pickup from UConn, and I think that gives UConn the advantage bigs-wise, because I feel like Nigene Hines, it might sound a little harsh, but I think he overall is better than Ruben Play. More moves that the Huskies picked up. They picked up Nicholas Kamina, a forward from Duke, a guy that I really loved. I thought that was a great pickup by the Huskies. A guy that didn't get a lot of playing time on Duke because, if people don't know, Duke is a pretty loaded team, and he really didn't get enough playing time. He's a guy that was a high recruit. I think UConn is really known for their 3-and-D guys. He can really shoot the ball, and I think he was a terrific pickup from the Huskies. And I think he kind of is like a Donnie Freeman. I don't think he's as big as Donnie Freeman, but I think he's more like that small forward, power forward, and I think that was a good get by UConn. Another guy they picked up at the center position was Oscar Gitte from Stanford, and that just proves that UConn is known for their 2 bigs. They had Adamo Sanogo, they had Donovan Clingan, Eric Leiber, who shockingly left UConn this offseason, and now with that 2-headed monster, I think that's going to give St. John problems. I think St. John's only really has 1 big in Ruben Play, and with that 2 big look from UConn, I think that can give St. John's issues at times. I think St. John's overall as a roster has more talent than UConn, because UConn's going to be without one of their best players in solo ball. But I think seeing the 2-headed monster at the center position for UConn, that could create issues not only for the Big East, but specifically St. John's. So it's going to be interesting to see those 2 battle it out. It's always a fun time that the city is revolved around the local ties to these 2 matchups. So it's going to be interesting to see how these 2 teams face off this season. Well, right now, St. John's has the upper hand. They've won 3 of the last 4 matchups between these 2 teams in the last couple of years. It's going to be interesting to see how these 2 teams match up heading into Big East play in the near future. So another school I want to talk about is Providence. I mentioned them with the Bryce Hopkins news. They really had a disappointing season. They fired their head coach, Kim English, and they hired a new coach. And look, this Flyers team is loaded. The new head coach they got was Brian Hodgkin from another school, but they picked up Malik Mack from the Big East from Georgetown, Miles Bird from San Diego State, Alton Page, a big guy from Northwestern, and a center, Samson Houghton from Yale. those four guys are one of the top transfers in the portal, and I thought Providence did a fantastic job getting guards, getting forwards, getting centers, because Providence at times beat St. John's Buckaboo at times. They beat St. John's at MSG, and after that game, everyone was saying, is the season over for St. John's? Because at that time, Providence was under 500, but Providence offensively was actually the best shooting team in the Big East, and their defense was really the issue. So I think with those additions, addressing the defensive lapse at times, I think Providence could give St. John's and UConn a run for their money. I don't think they're going to battle them out for the top two spots, but I wouldn't be surprised if Providence is at the 3 spot. And another school that I'm going to talk about in a sec, I really think the Big East is more versatile and loaded compared to other conferences. Another school that I want to talk about, connection to St. John's because of their head coach, is Xavier. Look, the Musketeers had a very underachieving year last year, kind of like Providence. Head coach Richard Pitino, the son of Rick Pitino. Those Pitino matchups were great last season, despite the fact that Xavier was underachieving. Xavier, another team, had a great transfer portal. Chance West, the guard from UAB. Mike Nwaka, the big from LSU. Ruben Dominguez, a sharp shooting guard from Texas A&M who shot over 40% from three-point range. We saw this last year from Xavier. They can really shoot the ball, and Dominguez adds that with this new Musketeers team heading into the season. They also got Trey Washington, a guard from Miami, who gives them a veteran presence overall as a team. And this just me iterating all these scores, that just shows that the Big East is kind of back. I really think it was an anomaly the way they were bad last season, but I really think St. John's compared to these other schools, I think it's really going to be them and UConn battling it out for the first 2 spots. But I'm just excited to see not just St. John's and UConn, the rest of the Big East, see if Georgetown can get back to their winning ways, because they've been kind of in the dust heading into college basketball. It'll be interesting to see DePaul take a step up in competition. Chris Holtman's done a fantastic job with that program. I'm just excited to see not only the Big East, but all of college basketball heading into this season, because in my opinion, college basketball is one of my favorite sports as a sports fan overall. I know that's kind of, you don't really hear that from kids my age, 21, just graduating, but I just like college basketball as a whole, and I love the NCAA tournament. Filling out your brackets, obviously not being biased as a St. John's guy, but I feel like that's just the best year in college basketball and sports as a whole. March Madness. It was awesome to be a part of St. John's journey last season. As I mentioned, I was able to cover St. John's with WSU Sports at Washington at Capitals One Arena, watching that St. John's Duke game. Look, St. John's had Duke. They should have beat them, in my opinion. They had a double-digit lead. Ruben Play was knocking down shots, kind of like Pitino for the first time. Got questions of, why didn't you play Ruben Play more? And he answered it by saying that he doesn't really like playing him with Zuby. But I kind of retort about that, because we saw that through stretches of last season's team. So I really think St. John's with this roster, look, it's too early to say are they going to do the same thing as last year's team, making it to the Sweet 16. I think they have the potential, they have the roster to do so. So I'm very excited to see how St. John's does heading into the season and compared to Big East schools. The one final topic I want to cover to end the debut episode. Look, I'm very excited to see how St. John's does. I'm really excited to see how this show goes as a whole. I'm going to have guests on. I'm going to have fellow students come on, give you their opinion about St. John's. I'm just excited to start this chapter, Red Storm Warning, and I'm excited to build this brand and potentially do great things coming from here. So the last topic I want to talk about is the NCAA implementing this new rule banning potentially European players from going to college basketball. So I read this article about this report that just got announced a few weeks ago, and at first it kind of took me back. I'm like, why are you deciding to do this now, as the season is only a few months away? European guys have already committed to schools like St. John's, and now you're deciding all of a sudden that you want to ban that from happening. in my opinion, the timing was off by a lot. I agree that I don't think European guys should go to college basketball because I feel like EuroLeague overseas is equivalent to the NBA. It's a professional league, and it's not fair that you're having those guys play over college kids. And I feel like NIL has been a boost of why your overseas guys want to come to college basketball. Because before NIL, you didn't really have this issue. You didn't really see European guys come to college basketball. And look, obviously, St. John's implemented that strategy this season. And I feel like St. John's is not going to get affected because if they pass this rule, this will probably be for the next year. But I definitely think the timing was off. I agree with not having your guys come to the college basketball because I think they have an unfair advantage playing overseas. And I think St. John's kind of, like other schools, it's kind of why they implemented that strategy. But I don't think that's a good rule overall. And I think having EuroLeague guys come to college basketball is not good for the sport. Like, look, we've seen it so far, not only overseas, but G League. RJ Lewis, a former St. John player. I loved him as a Johnny's player. He was a great Johnny. Had kind of a worst way to end his St. John's career, putting up a goose egg against Arkansas a couple of years ago. As St. John's got upset by John Calipari and his squad. But I think RJ Lewis played in the G League, got a title with Boston Celtics. He should not be able to come back to college basketball. He has a career in the NBA. I know he's playing in the G League, but play better so you can potentially get NBA looks. But he should not be able to come back to college basketball. That's why I think the EuroLeague is an issue. But I think college basketball, the NCAA committee, have to focus on not having guys who've played in the NBA G League come back to college basketball, because that just hurts the game. College basketball is not supposed to be professionalized like it is now, but the way the money is making, the way NIL is coming, college basketball, it's safe to say, it's professional now. And seeing guys like RJ, he's not the only guy, but he has a shot of coming back to college, play at LSU. That shouldn't happen. Another guy that actually has Big East ties, and a former Knicks player with the Westchester Knicks, the G League affiliate, is Dank Paints. He committed to Providence. He's coming back to college to play in the Big East. That's already official. Like he got the waiver, he got the claim, and he's coming back. That should not happen. I saw Dank Paint play in the G League with Westchester. He should not be able to come back to college basketball because he's played in the pros, well, the minor league affiliate of the pros. That should not happen. We saw this last season. We saw guys like Ahmed, another Westchester Knick, come back to BYU, play with them. You saw Ninja from Baylor. He got scrutinized for coming back to college basketball. In his first game, he got booed by the opposing fan base. College basketball is in a great spot. I love the game. I love covering it, and I love doing it for St. John and the Big East. But they have to do a better job controlling players coming to college basketball. College basketball is for college athletes. As I mentioned, the mantra of student athlete, I'm starting not to see student first. Now it's more athlete first. And I think college basketball is in a dangerous spot of becoming more professionalized, and I don't think that's the case. But I think they have to do a better job controlling the narratives of having players play overseas, play in the G League, coming back to college basketball. Because look, NIL was something that was going to happen eventually, and I think the players should get paid, especially using their name and image when they're getting branded and having those sponsorships. But I don't think G League guys overseas should get the opportunity that these guys are doing. So I just think that has to be, NCAA has to do a better job of setting those rules. But luckily, St. John's is not going to be affected because they just started talking about this now. I highly doubt this gets official before the season starts. If it does, it puts St. John's in a really rough spot because half of their roster is European guys. And if they enforce this rule, what's the carryover effect for St. John's? Do they have to get new guys? Do they have to go beyond to the G League to get new players? So it's going to be really interesting to see how that goes on. So that's going to do it for the debut episode of Redstone Morning. Hope everyone enjoyed the show. Looking forward to starting this new chapter. I'll be on every Monday from 1 to 2 to talk about the Johnnies. And especially the closer we get to the season, it's definitely going to be exciting times to be a Red Storm fan. So that's going to do it for me. Hope everyone enjoyed the show. I'll be back next Monday to talk Johnnies and college basketball. And have yourself a good rest of your day. And as always, go Johnnies.